Hello. In this video we're looking at building techniques for the Newman Miniatures N-Gauge kit of Locomotion No. 1, the famous engine designed by George Stephenson and used at the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825. As you can see, we have three parts to the model. We have a tender, we have the main locomotive itself, and we have a bundle pack of various small parts which I shall detail in just a moment. Now, starting with the tender, this is very simple to construct. This simply consists of our usual format for Newman Miniatures kits. So we have space underneath and in the coal load for weight. We have simple axle boxes for wheels to be added, and there are pre-drilled holes for couplings. Literally, that is all that's required other than paint and a crew, so creating the finalised model. The locomotive itself also has a number of parts on the underside of it. We have two beams and we have two pistons. More on that a little bit later. However, we have this bundle pack. Now you'll notice that it's a different material to the locomotive and tender. This is deliberate because if I turn it round, you will see that we have as the most important feature the series of rods, valves and supports which usually resides between the two cylinders just here on the engine. This would be far too fragile if produced in the usual plastic, but conversely, while you can of course scratch build your own, this is given as an alternative which simply can be painted and slots straight in place. We also have on here elements for the connecting rods. If I turn this round, you can see that we have the various cranks and a couple of washers. And lastly, we've thrown in as a little bonus for the model 3 figures. We have a fireman and a driver, both in traditional stereotypical clothing of this period as navvies in essence, and we also have a gentleman in a top hat. The clothing might be slightly later than the engine, but it is of course George Stephenson himself. Having explained the tender, if we now start to look at the locomotive itself. Now, I mentioned that there are various parts on the underside of the locomotive casting here. So the first thing is to remove these. Now, I personally prefer using snips, but there are various ways which the case can be done. Now, you may notice we have a couple of attachment points. So, a little bit proud, if we just snip on one side, turn it over, and very carefully snip the other side, making sure that we don't damage any of the detail in the process. There we go. It's as simple as that. As you can see, we are now at the next stage, which I've already partially started. So the locating points for the lower parts have been cleaned up. The model itself has been re-cleaned to ensure that the boiler area is free of any wax, as are the cylinders. I'll mention more on those in a moment. And I have added some weight using a hole in the centre of the boiler. Now, I've taken the two pistons, which were two of the extra parts, these very small little plastic rectangles, and I've added them onto 0.5mm piston rods. These are deliberately too long at this stage. These pistons do have a very slight chamfering of the top edge, so do make sure that you add them the right way. I've then very lightly filed them down on each side, other than the bottom of course, to ensure a good fit. Now, this is a very important part, particularly when adding the weight. Make sure that the two cylinder areas here and here are completely left alone. You want as good a fit of the pistons as possible. The whole point of having pistons in this model is that they are keeping the beams in line, therefore dispensing with all of the fine workings which are part of the knitting, for want of a better term, located between the two cylinders. Now, by the same token, you want them to keep the beams in line, but you want there to be an easy up-down sliding action, hence filing them to suit. I've also used a very soft pencil to gently put a little bit of graphite on the edges, which helps in this particular regard as a sort of lubricant. Similarly, do make sure that all the wax has been removed from this, both by cleaning, also you can use a pin just to scrape into the corners, and once you have the piston at this stage, you can even use that as a bit of a scraper, fitting it in place, like so, and just gently pushing it up and down. Ultimately, you want something which is a nice, easy sliding movement, as you can see there. Once that's done, the pistons are working correctly, the weight has been added. The next major stage is to paint the model. Turning to wheels. When Locomotion number 1 was built, it had ordinary spoked wheels, until a boiler explosion led to a major rebuild when it gained its now iconic Hackworth-style plug wheels. Sometimes we look at our models and decide we can do things a bit better. And as you'll see throughout this video, which is an updated version of an earlier one, originally the model was designed to take commercial wheels with paper overlays to represent the plug wheels format. However, we've now developed a completely brand new set of 3D printed plug wheels specifically for this Locomotion model. So you don't have to worry about that. You've got something much easier to manufacture, but also which gives a greater level of detail. The wheels are pre-gauged, everything is pre-prepared, and they are bespoke for Locomotion with no quartering, which is quite unusual with most locomotives, but correct for this particular one. All that is necessary to prepare them consists of drilling out the connecting rod hole, and we would also recommend drilling out a few other holes which you can see around for aesthetic purposes. This is not necessarily vital, but it does improve the look of the model. These wheels come with the bundle pack for the locomotive, both in N and in OO, as you can see in the pictures here. And the bundle packs, of course, have various parts already mentioned, and also have washers and return cranks. Locomotion was one of the earliest engines to have coupling rods, which of course need 90-degree angle to each other, known as quartering, which of course conflicts with the beam, hence the need for these little return cranks. The use of these explains a little bit further along, but basically they just need drilling out and sanding down very slightly just to improve the aesthetic of them. What we recommend is, because the washers and the cranks need to be the same thickness, if you sand them down together before cutting them individually, it makes the job easier. Returning to the engine, we have the fully painted locomotive here, and you can see that I have temporarily slotted the valve gear in place on the top. This has not been glued in quite yet. You'll also see that I've done the first of the beams, the second of which I'm going to explain now. So we have the piston and the overlong rod, as we put together earlier. And so the first part, to state the obvious, is to slot this in place inside the engine, which goes up and in. Come on. Like so. Next, if we put this down, we take the beam and slot it on the top. It should be a moderately tight fit. Remember, of course, the beams are handed, so this one, for example, has the pump rod connection, so it needs to be on the very front right. So hold that in place, push it down, and we have it temporarily in place. Now the trick here, because you want to have as much travel as possible, is to line up the beam at its lowest point with the piston at its lowest point, which, if you can see, is just at that height, so it's not impacting on the axle or the gear of the wheel if you're using one with that, but that is at the same time not allowing it to go any further than that. So once the piston is in the right place, like so, we push the beam into its correct position, turn it round, with a pen mark off precisely where we want it to be. Once that's done, the beam can be taken off, it can be cut to position, and ultimately then glued in place, like this rear one, which, as you can see, has very clear and free movement. And now we come to the most important part of construction, the various rods connecting the beams to the wheels. So you can see here we have two verticals from the beams to the wheels and the associated lower pins. However, from the bundle pack I mentioned earlier, now drilled and gently sanded, we have a washer and the main crank. Then we have our coupling rod and an additional pin. So we're going to put this together as an assembly, which is then moved over onto the locomotive itself. So if we start off by taking the crank, the coupling rod, if I move this round at 90 degrees, place that so it lines up, and then adding the smallest amount of glue possible. There we go. We fit this in position. This is probably the most fiddly of them, so it's useful to do this one first. Just going to lightly tap that into place. Good. Turn it round to check that it's flush on the back, which it is, and most importantly that it is free and loose. So with the glue set and the crank now in place, if we turn to the rear wheel set for this side, so if we bring the washer out and the pin, the pin goes in because the coupling rod is on the outside of all of this layer of various rods. And there we have the washer in place. If we just push that properly into position, there we go. We don't want it jammed on, but we want there to be sufficient lightness of movement. Similarly, if we then take this pin and push it through the other end of the crank, get the crank upright. So just if I do it on the card, you can probably see a bit better. So there's the crank, and the pin dropped on the floor. One moment, this happens to the best of us. Sorry about that, happens to the best of us as said. So we have our pin, and we fit this into place on the crank. There we go, that's it, loosely located. Now let's push it into place. Actually, probably better to use the jeweler's hammer in this particular instance. There we go, that helped. And now to push it home. Now this one you want to push all the way, and you'll see that the head is now flush with the rest of it. From there, loosely done, it's simply a case of slotting on those and then feeding these through the running board and then pushing these into place. The tops can then be pinned into the beams. And in good tradition, here's one I did earlier. So if I turn this round, you can see all of the rods in position. Now, with all of the rods in place, we can do some fine tuning. This is simply a case of making sure that everything is running smoothly, so ensuring that the beams, for example, are keeping straight and in line, making sure that everything is working fine. A couple of points. Firstly, of course, once this is done, you can glue in place the valve gear. You can also add strips of plastic, such as this, to keep the wheels in place. And ultimately, the result is something which looks like that. Now, naturally, there's some points which need fine painting here, and then we're going to be going on to the final elements of the build, the pump and the final details. Here we have the pump ready, completed and fitted in place. You can see it just here. It consists of a thin piece of styrene, little hole drilled in each end. I mentioned earlier the importance of ensuring that holes were kept clean. This includes a very fine hole just through here where it's slotted in place. Ultimately, a couple of very fine pieces of fuse wire have been used, firstly to secure it here, secondly to create this linkage. Consequently, the beam now works as the engine goes along. A simpler alternative, you can always simply glue the rod straight in place as a cosmetic feature. And then lastly, we have the final detailing elements. So in the case of a tender, you'll see we of course have the fireman. There's a coal load, that's hiding another piece of lead weight just to ensure stability of the item. And if I turn the engine around, you'll see that we now have a driver in place as well. The final element, just glued onto a little piece of plastic so it can be portable, we have Mr. Stephenson himself. Once again, as an example of scale, here we have a ruler. Locomotion number 1 is a very iconic engine from the earliest days of steam, and I hope that these instructions give an outline of how to put together a model of quite a wonderful locomotive and something truly unusual to add to your model railway. Thank you for watching.